Hi, Dave Scotland for cgswot.com and welcome to another tutorial. Today we're going to take a look at a lens effect, and it's actually a dirt on the lens effect that's done in After Effects, and it's in answer to an email I got from Jack in Seattle who wanted to know, is there a quick and easy way to make it look like the lens is dirty, which is often used in a documentary style footage. So the easiest way that I know of is the way I'm about to show you, which just uses some fractal noise, and we'll get started. I've got this footage here, and it's just a simple pan of a landscape with the sun in the background. And the reason I chose this footage is there is something that you need to be aware of whenever you're doing a lens dirt effect, and that is that the dirt on the lens becomes more dominant when there's light reflecting straight at the lens, and when there's not as much light you won't see the dirt as easily. So we need to keep that in mind when we're doing this particular effect, and you'll see what I mean when we get started. So let's just close this preview window here. I'm just going to drag our background plate into a new comp, and you'll see there that we have our background plate in a brand new comp. We're just going to rename this to master comp, and we'll do all of our work in this comp. So the first thing we need to do is create our dirt, and I'm going to do two different sizes of dirt. I'm going to do a small and a large, but we can start with the small and then we can just simply duplicate and make a few amendments. So I just need to bring up my effects controls, and I'm going to create a new solid, and let's make this solid, let's just make it middle grey in color, and we're just going to call this dirt small. Make it comp size and go OK. Now on this one it didn't really matter what color it was, because we're going to create a fractal noise which takes over for the contents. So we'll just go noise grain, fractal noise, and similar to how you create a star field, we're just going to ramp this scale down. I think we'll put it at about 3 on the scale, and then just going to increase the contrast and decrease the brightness just until we get the right consistency of dirt that we're looking for, and I think something like that is going to work for us. And what I'm also going to do with that is I'll just close this here, and I'm also going to put a blur sharpen fast blur, and I'm just going to test it out to show you the sort of effect that we're going for. If I just ramp up the blur, that's about the consistency of the dirt that we're going to be shooting for. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to reduce that fast blur to 0 just so we can see what we're doing here a little better. I'm going to double click on our ellipse tool, and that's going to create a nice mask, and I'm going to turn it from add to subtract, and I'm also going to feather that considerably, and then I'm also going to bring it in on its expansion. Something like that's going to work okay. Now at the moment what we've done is created a black and white image. If I just hide my underlying image, we have a black and white image. In fact, we're getting some grey in the image, and the reason for that is we used a middle grey for our base solid colour. So we're just going to change that solid colour to pure black and go OK. And now we're getting a black and white image where the white is the particles of dirt created by the fractal noise. So we can now use that as a luma matte on a solid. So we're just going to go new solid, and this solid we're going to make sort of, just put it in the brown spectrum, fairly neutral, something like that is fine. And we're just going to call this dirt solid, make it comp size, click OK. I'm just going to drag it down underneath our small dirt, and I'm going to change the track matte to a luma matte. And now if I unhide my base material and come in here, show you a section, we now have dirt on our lens, but it's a little bit too crisp. So that's why we did the fast blur, and we can just up the value for the fast blur just to give some nice dirt on the lens. And it sticks because the footage is moving but the dirt's not, then it will read as if we have dirt on that lens, with a little bit of a vignette happening so that we don't get too much dirt in the center. If you wanted a little bit more dirt, you could certainly just wind this blur value down and then bring up for mask and just bring the expansion in a little bit, and just leave a little bit of a core in the middle without too much dirt. Otherwise we're going to use too much, and subtlety is always the key with this sort of stuff. So we have our small dirt, and I'm just going to lock off that fast blur. Just going to put it on 1. I'm going to grab both of those layers now, Control D, and on the top rename to Dirt Large. And I'm just going to isolate those 2 layers, or at least the dirt, because it's set up as a luma matte. And I'm also going to turn that fast blur down just so I can see what's happening. And in the fractal noise, what I want to do is bring the transform up in scale, just until we get some dirt that's a little larger on the screen. And we can also bring up the evolution settings or evolution options, and just change the random seed until we get a dirt pattern that we're happy with. And I think that one there is going to be fine. Just close this down, and now we'll just see what level of blur is required for that one to work. So I think out around 5 or 6 is going to be fine. We can switch on our other layers and see how that's working. And you can see there we now have the 2 distinct sizes of dirt on the lens, and as the camera moves we get the dirt, and it's working nicely. But I mentioned before that this effect is heavily reliant on the amount of light that's coming into the lens, and in the start of our footage we don't have as much light, or anywhere near as much light, as we do when the sun actually pops into our view. So we're going to emphasize this with a lens flare as well. And I thought while we're here I might as well show you a little trick to animating a lens flare, or animating an object that is off screen. And this is a method I use quite a lot. So the first thing I'm going to do is just hide my 2 dirt layers, and I'm just going to right click on my background plate, and I'm just going to go track motion, which brings up my tracker here. So I need to find a point that is actually visible throughout the entire clip, and I think any one of these little lake formations down here is pretty good. So somewhere up in here I think is going to be fine. So what I'm going to do is just go to frame 1 and drag over. I think I will go for this little double lake formation here. Something like that looks good. And I'm just going to track the footage. We don't need any rotation. This footage was taken on a tripod, so there's no rotation with it, and if there is, it's extremely minimal, so we should get away with it. So I'm just going to analyze forward to get a track. That seems to be tracking nicely. So we've got that track now. What I'm going to do is go layer, new, null object. I'm just going to drag it down actually on top of my background plate, and I'm going to edit target, making sure that the null object is selected. Go OK, and then I'm going to just give myself a bit of room here, and I'm going to apply in the X and Y and go OK. So now I have a null object that's tracked to the movement of the camera via a target track in the footage. But I want to put a lens flare over here where the sun is, and this is the way I'll do it. So with the null object, I'm just going to bring up the transform controls here, And the anchor point, I'm going to animate or move using the two values here. I'm going to move it until it's perfectly in line with that sun. So I'll slide in here a little bit, make sure it's nice and accurate. So that's pretty close on the X. It's looking pretty good. And then on the Y, we'll just bring it up, maybe a little bit less on the X, and that looks good. Now, you're probably wondering, well, now all we need to do is pass that information to a lens flare, but the problem is that the anchor point is a value minus or plus from the position point, and we can't just pass that to the position of the lens flare. But what we can do is a little bit of script, and it's not too difficult. What I'll do first is set up our lens flare. I'm just going to go for a new adjustment layer. We'll just rename it flare, and I'm going to put a lens flare on it just to generate lens flare. And I'm just going to move this over so that we can get a rough idea of how it's going to look, and that's working okay. So the center of the lens flare, what I'm going to do is alt click on flare center, and that's going to bring up a little bit of script over here, and I'm going to type in what because it's only a 2D position, two-dimensional position, X and Y, it's looking for an X and Y value, and so it's just two values to work out where this flare center needs to be. So I can set up a little array to get this to work. So the first thing I do is go X equals, and then I'll just drag this up slightly. What I want to do is highlight or put the cursor after the equal sign, and then pick whip down to the X value for the position of the null. And this is what comes up. But you'll notice for our anchor point, it's minus 664. So instead of minus, I'm going to go plus 664. Then I'm going to drop down to a new line, Y equals, and then pick whip to the Y value, and then I'm going to notice here 153 is the Y value away from the anchor point, and it's a plus, so I'm going to minus 153. Now all I need to do is put in the actual expression to calculate the X and the Y, which is square bracket X comma Y close square bracket. Now the last thing we need to do in order to get this to run is to close our array, and we do that with a semicolon. And now if I just slide this down a little bit and show you, we now have the absolute center of our lens flare perfectly aligned with the sun, and that's exactly what we're looking for. So what we can do now is a little bit of keyframe animation just to get these values to really ramp up when this sun pops into view. So it's not in view, it's in view there at frame 7 seconds 21. I might just control click on that to bring up an absolute frame value. So at 183 is when it actually is half in, and it's not in at 173. So the values I want to animate is for the flare, just toggle this up a little bit, for the lens flare, it's actually the flare brightness. So I'm going to click on a keyframe there, and I'm going to ramp it down to around about, let's say 20%, and then come across until the sun is in shot, which is about here, and then I'm going to ramp it up to get the effect that I'm looking for, something like that. And you'll see there that it pops on, and we're getting a nice lens flare effect there. So we're going to use the position of those keyframes to also animate our dirt. So just select both the dirt solids, hit T for transparency, and give myself a little bit more real estate here. And I might just hit U on the flare to bring up those keyframes. So there we are there. And I'm going to create a keyframe for opacity, and I also need to turn them on so that they're visible. And what I'm going to do is try to ramp down the opacity until I'm happy with its transparency. So the large ones I'll do first. Something like that is good. About 20. Let's make it an even 20. And then the small, come in a little closer. The small ones we're going to ramp down to around about 30. Looks good. And then when we get into shot, or get the lens flare into shot, we're going to ramp those up until they're visible. We'll come out away from the lens flare a little bit. Something like this. So we're ramping it up. I think around about 80 should do. And we might try that with the large lens flare as well, the large dirt particles as well. Actually, they're fine at 100. And that looks like it's working fine. So there's just a very subtle amount of dirt before the lens flare kicks in. You can see it there. And then once the lens flare kicks in, we get a nice lens effect on the screen. Now, just with the lens flare, I might go for one of the other flare types. In fact, I think the 5300 zoom is going to work okay for our purposes. So let's give that a ramp preview and see what we have. So it's looking not too bad, but I think what I'd like to do is have the dirt actually start to get brighter as the camera comes across the scene. So if we just come back to this keyframe here, you'll see that the opacity is 30 and 20. So I'm going to go back to frame 0, and instead of 20, I might just click on a keyframe for 20 and 30 there, but when we get to here, I'm going to bring 20 up to, say, let's make it 45, and that's going to work nicely. So it starts out quite dark, it gets brighter and brighter, and then it ramps up to inevitably, I'll just hide that null, ramp preview it. So this is something I think you should definitely have a bit of a crack at. It's only a very quick way to get dirt on the lens, and it's very effective. Now, you could use the same technique if you wanted the effect of a camera moving behind glass, as if it was being filmed from inside a building, something like that. Instead of locking off the dirt layers, you would link them to a null object that's tracked in the shot, and that way they would actually stay static to the background, and it would appear as if the camera was actually moving. So that's something that I might have a look at in a future quick tip. So the other thing that I think you definitely should have a bit of a try of is the method that we used there before, just with that script, in order to get the center of the lens flare to sit on the sun, even though we tracked a totally different object out here. I thoroughly suggest that you have a bit of a look at that. It's something, if you do understand it, and once you get it to work, it's something that you can use with a lot of different effects to achieve a lot of different outcomes. So give it a crack and see how you go. That's it for me. Until next time, bye for now.